Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the live stream for the Clarion update. Today I'm joined by James Mart, who has very generously offered to step in for the unreplaceable Brandon Lovejoy. Lovejoy has been with us for months doing this live stream. He was the one who kicked off the live stream. We have huge gratitude for everything he set up and run through that time, and James is stepping in to fill his large shoes. So James, thank you and welcome to the live stream.
Yep. Hi. I'm excited to do it.
So we've got a short update today. Depending on how many people are here and how many questions we have, I'm happy to hang out for the hour, but I'm going to give a shorter update because we're at Clarion right now. After the election, we're doing some consolidation, some planning, some refactoring of the code in preparation for the next push. Brandon Fancher will be on next week to talk more about that. But the short of it is expanding the election experience to be smoother and dealing with some of the feedback we got from the first election, as well as some critical next additions for things like transfer of funds and replacement of accounts. Right? What if someone loses their account? How do we deal with that? There's a couple like smaller pieces that are critical the moment they become critical. So
the edge cases where things go wrong.
Exactly.
In the beginning of this call, it's possible we're competing with the Crypto Writer live stream. Just so
really?
You know. So the viewer count might be a little lower, and then maybe it'll bump up later. We'll see.
But, okay, cool. I had no idea. All right, Han is clapping. Thank you, Han. All right, well, let's dive right into the update. And James, on my last slide, I may invite some input on the topic of justice.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that's something James and I have talked about recently, and we'll see how much of that we get to. So let's start with the update.
The open mic.
The open mic. Never without a pun if you're around Dan Larimer. So you guys have been through this before, but for anyone who hasn't watched before, we'll do announcements, we'll do updates, we'll talk fractal governance. Disclaimer, some of these are forward-looking. We are not financial advisors. All the things you know we're supposed to warn you about. You've been warned. Resources, if you haven't seen these, EdenOnEOS.org, all about Eden. The public wiki, wiki.eoscommunity.org. And the GitHub repo that we do almost all this work in is github.com/eoscommunity/Eden. All right, let's do some announcements and updates. So just a quick update on Eden. Like I said, we're doing refactors and upgrades. A lot of this was when Todd wrote his history solution. That was brand new, right? He was writing that code just as we were approaching the election. So at the time of the election, we only used that solution for the election stats page, the summary page. So now we're upgrading the entire portal to use that same system. And we're doing some badly needed refactors and the small features we talked about.
Can you give like a super high level reminder of what the history solution was that Todd?
Yeah, so on blockchain generally, not just an EOS problem, there's information that you keep current and accessible, and that's stored in contract tables. That's stored in RAM resource that we talk about on EOS. But that should be only current state. That should be only the most current stuff, the stuff that's needed to move the contract forward. Anything else that's not current state is hypothetically supposed to be stored in history, stored in the block log, right? As you're as you're making requests of the chain, as you're sending actions to the chain, that history of actions is all on chain also. It's all recorded as part of the history of the chain. So all of that historical information that's not current state needs to be accessed. And that's actually a pretty big problem. It's a problem generally in blockchain, and it's a really big problem for us because with our performance comes huge storage, huge, gargantuan block logs, larger than most. So processing all that data and providing access to that history of what people have transacted online is a pretty big issue. So we leverage a solution called Defuse, which consumes the terabytes of blockchain history and crunches that into a stream based on our request, a limited stream based on blocks that we've told them we're interested in. We take that stream and we process that into the actual data we need to serve the front end. So to step up a level and say that a little more simply, there's data like who are the current delegates. That's current information. That might be something that you have in RAM. That's always accessible. Who were delegates in the previous election? Obviously historical. And it's not even quite that simple. There's stuff that's historical you might not expect to be historical, but you've got that distinction of data that's currently accessible in RAM and data that's not. And so we needed some way to get and organize that historical information.
Cool. Yeah, that was clear. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. This is something I don't think we've said here, and for anyone who doesn't know, you should know. The Chiefs do a weekly update. I was rushing this, so I did not get a link to that, but I'm sure it's easy to find in the Eden members channel. The Chiefs do a weekly update. Highly recommend you watch that. That's probably the best way to keep up with the status of what's going on in the community.
Chris Barnes has also been posting like a high-level summary that he types up during that meeting onto Violet Garden for anyone that is interested. So that's a way to, if you don't have the hour plus that that meeting usually goes, then you can check those notes on Violet Garden.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
And then potential collaborations. We are exploring opportunities for where else we can use EdenOS. We don't have anything definitive yet, but we're basically looking for where else can EdenOS be useful to other communities, businesses. What are the other opportunities? And this is also an experiment. This is also early on, right? We're innovating a new technology. And so we're looking for opportunities to iterate what we're doing. And with an election every 6 months, there's not a lot of opportunity to iterate. So we are actively searching for potential collaborations where governance is needed and where people see the value of Eden and want to try it out. So that's a very early stage conversation, but for the sake of transparency, I wanted to throw it out there that we are looking for opportunities to use Eden and iterate the process.
Does that mean you would want people to reach out who are interested in trying to organize an Eden for their own community, or is this a I don't know, somehow more targeted search that you're doing?
It's largely targeted. However, I would be short-sighted to not invite input. So let me think about what I want to request. Let's see. This would be on-chain, right? We're looking to leverage what we already have. We want to keep development costs small and iteration fast.
ESIO.
ESIO. And we're in terms of communities we want spun up, we are really committed to get the 4 core EOS languages spun up with distinct communities pretty early. I'm going to be speaking with the representatives from the Chinese community this week about what that might look like. So we are moving forward that conversation, but we're looking for people who are already on chain, who want to. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to make this a useful request. Sorry, I should have thought about this. Let's go with targeted. It's really targeted, and
Yeah.
we do have a couple opportunities we're exploring, and why it's so hard to put this in a succinct request is we have explored things. There's what we want to do. I'm with everyone in this community. What do we want to do? Well, we want to spin up not just the 4 languages, but as many communities as we can, and we want to be on every chain we can, and we want to be off chain. Like, I want to do all of that, and we have to be laser sharp and lean about what's proximal, right? What can we do that's just a small tweak, and we get to iterate more, because we can't like start a whole new project to bring Eden to some other chain, or even off chain.
Limited bandwidth, so you have to stay highly focused.
Very limited bandwidth. So I suppose I could make the request. If you think you have a suggestion that is proximal for us that we really should be looking at, feel free to reach out. I would invite all of that, and just know that you may get a not yet. All right, cool. Any other questions about that?
Nope. Looks good to me.
All right, beautiful. ClarionOS. So the ClarionOS platform, I think we can pretty solidly call on pause at the moment. We are seeing the opportunity in governance strongly enough, and there's enough work to do that with the tiny team we have, running 2 projects in parallel just doesn't make sense. So the ClarionOS platform will be on pause. We're not saying it's dead in the water at all. In fact, I'll talk about my next bullet point in a moment, but I just want to let everyone know we only had 1 person working on it, and we're going to be pausing that so that we can focus on governance. Governance, from within the community, I think it's actually pretty easy to lose sight of how much isn't done, right? How much still needs doing. We had our election. The election went well. The software functioned smoothly. The people at the top, I think the vast majority of the community, if not everyone, is happy with who got elected. So I think it looks like a gargantuan success that it was, but that leaves a lot of things that still need attention. We want to be building dispute resolution. We want to have more easy access to transparency, so that not only do we vote people in and the contract distributes funds, but what happens with those funds? We want that to be easily accessible. So there's still a lot to do, and we're finding that we really need to put our brains on that and iterate that. Dan is highly focused on bylaws right now. That is his primary focus right now. It's an area that we hadn't had time to get to. It was the next thing. We needed delegates in a community before it was relevant, and now it's relevant. So he's working on the bylaws as a huge focus. But all of this we're finding is taking it's taking the whole team. So that's on pause. We may or may not return to that in the future. As an alternative, shall we say, we're looking at potential collaboration here as well. We have identified a team that, in a rare bit of non-transparency, I'm going to bite my tongue just probably 1 more week. But we are looking at a potential collaboration with a team that is working in the same space. They are focused on decentralization. They're even here's the carrot I'll unfairly dangle. They're taking the ClarionOS idea in some respects even further than we did. It's a very exciting project, really amazing group of people, and it looks like that may turn into a collaboration which will allow the ideas of ClarionOS to become reality even without our team
Wow.
doing the engineering. So fingers crossed on that. That's a huge pass. I don't know,
Yeah,
Hail Mary. It's not really a Hail
you
Mary pass, but
certainly piqued everyone's interest.
yeah,
That's
I tend to do
quite
that.
the
I
carrot.
don't I don't mean to dangle carrots, but like I just again I don't want to like say something that's wrong now and just 1 week later like have
Yeah,
the thing to say that's way more informative. So
sure.
yeah, fingers crossed on that.
Cool. Well, I have many questions that I'll hold to next week when we get more
Beautiful.
details.
All right, let's see what else we have here. Fractal governance. So I've been on my slide set, so let's jump back to the chat. I got nothing going on in the chat. So yeah, so let's move on to dispute resolution. If you have any comments or questions, you can drop them in the chat. I think, James, I don't think you can see that the way we're configured at the moment, so I'll keep
Yes,
watching mine.
I'm actually just opening up. I'm just going to open up the YouTube live stream and then mute it, and then
Okay.
yeah.
All right, yeah, interrupt me if there are any questions from there.
Yeah, I'm on like a 2-minute delay, or I don't know the time, but I'm on some delay, and then if I see anything, I'll interrupt you.
Sounds good. Let's play with these controls that are new to me. Live viewers, I don't think they're listed, but yeah, we could look at YouTube. All right, so let's continue with this dispute resolution. So I wanted to share some of the thinking that's going on. There's there's something I read years ago that has stuck with me ever since, and given that I've told it to a few people recently and they've repeated it back to me, I figure it's worth sharing with a bigger mouthpiece. If you consider the origin of the United States, we fought a war, we declared our independence, we fought a war, we gained our independence, and then just think about living back then and having independence and having no government, right? Just being states. The states kind of were their own thing, but a small group of people got together and said, okay, now what? And they had to put together the foundation for a country. Not many people get that opportunity, right? Or that burden and challenge, or whatever word would be appropriate.
Right.
But when I confronted that idea many years ago, it really struck me like, wow, these were people who had just a unthinkably large challenge ahead of them. And not only that, they were scholars. These are people who read, Jefferson, I've read many times, read a book a day. A book a day. And to form a country, you've got to think like, what does a justice system look like, and what is republic, democracy, some kind of oligarchy? Like, you have options, right? Parliamentarian, common law, civil law. You've got all these historical options, and you've got to put a system together, and it's got to be consistent, and it's got to work. And like, how did they go about that? It just blew my mind to consider a small group of people figuring that out together. And as I learned later, like it wasn't like they all had the same idea and they were, okay, let's build this system. Like, they had dissenting opinions about how that should go.
Right. That is part of what is so exciting about all the innovation going on in the blockchain space. Is it is really mainstreaming these questions about, because you see the same concepts of neutrality and checks and balances and trying to avoid political parties and a lot of these things that they were very familiar with from their own challenges with governance in their own countries. And now we have a whole new generation of tools, and really blockchain, the transparency and neutrality that it brings is just, I wonder what they would have built. Maybe we're getting a chance to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's huge shoes to fill, and I'm glad that we don't have an actual country who's waiting
Yeah.
on our work. But it is that important, and I strive to read a few books that Jefferson read. I certainly cannot consume a book a day, but I have tried to read the big works, and Dan has read lots for a very long time. He's read all of the basics and a whole lot of books beyond that. He's in that sense, he kind of mirrors that idea. So why do we do that, right? I here Mike's gonna get up on a soapbox. I haven't gotten on a soapbox yet in these live streams, so Mike's gonna get on a soapbox. We say this some version of if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? There's that quote that everybody says slightly differently. Well, if you think about history will repeat itself if you don't study it, the question arises, how should one study history? And it seems to me one should study history from what are the valuable lessons, right? What are the pitfalls that you should really know about, right? Because you will repeat them. Human beings have been human beings for a very long time. We're not fundamentally different. We trip over the same stuff. We strive for the same things. It's the same game as it's been for a long time. And so don't study history at your own peril. And so that's another idea that's really, really struck me. And a reason why, if you ask me certain questions, I will take you back 200 years and you'll protest of why do you need to go back 200 years just to make an argument? And, I'll try to make that argument. So anyway, with that as background, study history, like read these critical works and read the problems of the past, because we are repeating many of them. And we are destined to repeat any of the ones we don't study.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of wisdom in the trials of the past. People like to think that we're just in an entirely new era with, that this is an entirely new scenario, but it's really not. We're genetically 99.9% the same, even as all of the ancestors of the past, and that has a large influence on the motivations and the way humans behave, which is very important how society functions.
Well, and I think societal topics and technology in particular, both of those two topics, make it feel like, oh, this is so different than how it used to be. But we're still human beings trying to get along. We're still human beings trying to put people in charge and not have that be a problem. It's the same basic problems. And one of the other paradigms I've come across that I think is really valuable in a conversation like this is the idea of tools. Technology is a whole bunch of tools, but it's just tools. We are still human beings trying to get along and coordinate and elect leaders. The tools that we use change, but they don't change that fundamental nature of what are we trying to accomplish and who are we. So, all right, I should get off the soapbox. That was good.
That was a good soapbox. Thanks.
Let's get on to what does all this mean? Why are we talking about all this? Well, we're talking about this because of dispute resolution. When we started looking at a dispute resolution system, and again, I guess I have to caveat this strongly. Dan wrote the book. Dan's done the study. I have, as a hobby, studied this stuff for years, but I've taken it on myself to study myself up so that Dan isn't the only one trying to make this stuff happen, right? I want to make sure that he's got company in ironing out these issues, because it's bad enough if you're 13 colony representatives or 20, 30 people or whatever the Constitutional Congress was trying to sort this out, but to put all this weight on Dan is just unfair, I think. So in my small, hopefully contributory way, I'm trying to come up to speed on the basics myself so that I can have an informed conversation with him. And a few people have joined me in that.
Awesome.
James is one of them. And I wanted to share a little bit of that framing, because I think, getting the more of the community that sees where we're coming from and the value of studying this stuff is, the better.
And let me just add too, it's not just a, intellectual pursuit. This is relevant to what we're building. Eden is dispute resolution. It's a way to reach consensus among people. So the more we learn about dispute resolution, the more we figure it out and learn from the past, the better equipped we are to build dispute resolution into smart contracts. In a very practical way, this could result in changes in a design that people will use to resolve disputes in communities.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. I think here's a mini soapbox number 2. Philosophy. I think most people relate to philosophy the way I did in college, which is an excuse to hang out with friends until the sun rises and just talk about whatever. It's usually abstract. It usually is not, you don't try to integrate it. You don't try to exactly match it to reality. It's not, philosophy isn't useful for living life for a lot of people who study it. And I only relate to it as philosophy should be useful for living life. And this is a great example. All of this that we study will feed into the dispute resolution process, and on the governance side, fractal governance, right? Why is Pareto a problem, right? What problems does that lead to? How do you combat that? These are critical questions to have fractal governance work the way we're all intent on it working. So today we'll deal with those questions around dispute resolution. And the first one I came across, which kind of just blew my mind because it's one of those simple questions that it's the water we swim in and we don't ask. If we're aiming to create a system of justice, right, a dispute resolution, right, two people have a dispute, they come together, resolve that dispute. What they're seeking is justice. But what do we mean by justice? I've asked people, what is justice? And it's a blank stare, which is my response when I read the question. So this is where we start. What's even the goal of a dispute resolution system? And so the two major answers that came out of history of building such systems are black and white implementation of the law, right? We have a republic, we have a set of laws, you broke the law or you didn't, and the law says what the penalty is. If that law is well defined and you broke it, well then that's easy, right? That's one form of justice. Just did we follow or not follow the law? But as you can imagine, and as we know from probably experience of certain types, life's not usually black and white. That's not how that works. And I wish I had an example. I should have looked up an example, but there are laws that are over specific that date themselves, and there are laws that are too vague that are applied where they shouldn't be, or not reliably applied because of how they're worded. So if you rely simply on implementation of the law, then you run into weird corner cases that it's just insufficient. It's too rigid and impossible to specify. So another answer, which is more I would say the mushy vibe of what people think of when they think justice, is fairness. Right? You want some, right? What is fairness? Equality is in there. Some kind of maybe libertarianism would talk about restoration. Putting things back the way they were.
My mind goes to that. It has to be some function of consensus among humans ultimately. So the idea of, especially if we're trying to encode something which can represent fairness or dispute resolution and justice, has to be something that is appealing to consensus rather than appealing to any perfect arbitration that we can maybe
Yep.
philosophically imagine.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the problem with fairness. Fairness is subjective, massively subjective.
Right.
If you were being put on trial in front of a jury of your friends, you would probably have one outcome. If you had a jury of your enemies, you'd probably have a different outcome, right? A jury of former boyfriends or girlfriends, right? Jury of family. We say jury of your peers, but what does that mean? How are we going to judge who your peers are? Are they the people you live near? Are they the people with the same level of income, same type of job, same hobbies, same love of music, right? What does it mean to have a jury of your peers? They will judge you differently depending on what the makeup of that jury is. In fact, we have jury selection. Court cases have jury selection, and you can eliminate jurors that you don't want on the jury. The attorneys will go through that process. So you're always dealing with some kind of subjective view of what's fair. And I'd also further bring in culture. There are things that in Mexico might be considered completely fair that in Thailand would be the last thing that you'd ever define fair as. We have massive cultural differences. We've lived literally a world apart, some of us, and we have different mindsets on what is fair. So it's a highly, highly subjective issue.
Maybe I see where you're going with this, but it calls to mind the distinction we've talked about before of the difference between justice or fairness or dispute resolution within a community that has agreed to be a community versus between communities that maybe
Right.
differ on fundamental principles.
Exactly. Yeah, and it leads to some interesting challenges, obviously, but also some interesting dynamics where, yeah, actually, I guess I'm skipping a step. Let's deal with what you just said. The culture of the community, right, has to include something where you'd feel comfortable having your disputes resolved by your peers. Right. So in Eden, let's measure the effectiveness of Eden at the moment by saying, if we selected almost random, if we select 5 Eden delegates of any level, how willing would you be to put something you'd normally deal with in a lawsuit or arbitration or something in front of a jury of Eden delegate peers? I would feel pretty comfortable with that at the moment. Yeah. But that's an interesting way to measure how much is this really a community to me? How much do I trust this community? How much would I rely on this community?
Yeah. This brings to mind too the importance of keeping the community at a limited size too, because I think as the size increases or as the number of people that I don't know in the elected delegates increases, that would reduce my confidence in their judgment on any dispute that I would be involved in.
Yeah, exactly. And it leads to some interesting things we've thrown around. We had reporting profiles as a action that we wanted to incentivize, right? We want to know if someone's posting a face that's not theirs or not a face, right? So we had a whole thing about that early on. We had a whole mini dispute resolution, our first dispute resolution based on a profile. Well, there's going to be a lot of issues like that need some kind of resolution. And if you don't have that cohesion, that cultural commonality that you'd rely on, then it's going to be too easy to go sue someone outside of Eden, where we'd rather just resolve disputes peacefully within Eden.
Yeah, I have many thoughts on the identity piece of Eden. Just the yeah, soft verification of identity as opposed to hard verification, where I think it's very possible to commit some kind of fraud in the Eden community where you, I mean, even already at its current size, I think it's possible to, if you're not very well known, you could get a couple different groups of friends in the Eden community and potentially create 2 Eden accounts. These are like, I've been trying to think about ways that you could defraud the Eden community and what the response would be to that. And I definitely see it as a problem that the future will have to face, especially as the incentives to become an Eden member go up. We have this UBI equivalent from Violet Garden right now, where we're getting some number of tokens from that platform. And if you imagine a future where the benefits to become an Eden member balloon, then so too does the incentive to create multiple accounts and yeah, find ways to scam the community. So this is very relevant, and it's really a promising sign, I think, that you're dealing with this early and you and the team are thinking about these things. So it's really good.
Yeah, and again, I encourage the entire community to study these topics and think through them and identify issues like that. Similar to profile pictures, consider how many Eden induction videos have you watched?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not monitoring, to have my own opinion about people who are coming into the community. I'm just not watching that. Now, from the Sybil perspective, once you have an election, everyone's got to be on camera at the same time, right? That's part of that design.
Right.
So for participation, it doesn't deal with the Violet Garden UBI issue, but again, there's layers of dealing with that. Anyone who's in an election, we now have proof, a proof of life at that moment because they were on camera in one place.
Right.
For the people who don't participate ongoingly, we should scrub them from the community because of this reason, because we can't provide that guarantee, right? If they get themselves in, whether they're good or not, like this isn't any evaluation ethically of a particular person, but if they're not participating, but they're there to collect their UBI, or they're there to, I don't know, that's UBI is probably the best example at the moment, but we need to maintain that culture and that cohesion.
That's actually a really interesting point that I don't know that I've heard brought up before, and at the moment can't recall if I remember reading that in More Equal Animals, some kind of if you don't participate for some amount of time, then you are potentially, it could even be potentially automatic. I mean, I remember back in the day with the original EOS constitution that went out, there was actually a 3-year, you remember this? There was some clause in there that said if your account is inactive on EOS for 3 years, your tokens are forfeited back to the community, which I think Dan was already thinking more about using EOS.io as the basis for the formation of smaller communities rather than a like one giant public decentralized public ledger, which is what everybody else was still on that wavelength of thinking like Ethereum. So we got a more code is law and a more traditional constitution or user agreement. But I do remember that was a conversation even back then about what do you do with people who are not participating.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is something, consider again, we have these like whispers of this in culture, and I find it useful to see them and point them out once in a while. If you put aside ideology and maybe perhaps even erase the last maybe 8 years of politics in the US, what's your view of someone who doesn't vote? Or what's your view of the idea of voting, right? We have these cultural ideas that whether or not your ideology and modern experience tell you otherwise, you should read the paper. Does anyone even know what that is? You should read the news so that you're kept informed of what's going on. So being informed is valued. And voting, man, we're a democracy. Like we have the opportunity to vote. We're a democratic republic. We have the opportunity to vote. There are plenty of places on this planet that don't have the opportunity to vote. You should vote. That is your privilege, right? So we have these ideas around what it means to participate. Now, actual voter participation is at near historic lows, if not historic lows. So we're seeing, again, minus 8 years. I don't know recently, but we've had numbers that are just atrocious. If you didn't know anything about reality and I asked you, like, well, how many people do you think would vote for who's going to be able to rule over them? You wouldn't guess the kind of numbers we have.
Right.
Everybody has a free vote. It's pretty easy to cast. How many people do you think cast it? There's no way you would guess a priori that the numbers are this low. So we value these things subconsciously.
Right.
And
well,
so
yeah, Dan talks about that in More Equal Animals for sure, about the the actual cost to vote, of the time to go to the ballot box and wait in line, which in some places is much worse than others, and then couple that with the vanishingly small influence you may have on your election in a direct democracy of size 300 million, and you end up getting people who don't vote, and you can kind of understand it. It's pretty rational. The cost really may outweigh the total possible benefit or influence you could have on the outcome of this election.
Yeah,
underscores the need for new election mechanics, to me anyway.
So I'll say this in a pokey, purposefully controversial, or it's not controversial, but pokey way to get the neurons firing. If you had the opportunity to remove people from the community, right? It's weird to talk about this at the national level, which is why this will be pokey. But let's say if you don't vote, you don't get any of the benefits of the government, right? If you're getting some kind of welfare, you don't get that anymore. If you're participating in the public education system, you don't get that anymore, right? If you have a college loan, then you have to pay it back immediately, right? If we had that opportunity to say, look, study up and vote, or don't get the benefits, that would change things a lot. Right? I'm not suggesting this isn't how I think things should go, but
right, yeah, it screams like opt-in governance to me. If you're agreeing to this process at the onset, then that sounds like a beautiful and neutral way to encourage participation, as opposed to some top-down rules given from, I could go on a libertarian soapbox at this point, the government with the guns saying that you must vote or whatever, and then you're at the you're at the mercy of how organized your local government or township is with the ballot box, and how painful that is for you. So yeah.
So, and some of this may be self-regulating in that there is a renewal donation each year for membership. So maybe that'll be enough to keep people out. If you don't come do the renewal process, right, that may naturally weed people out. But I think it's more valuable to think, because we're not used to thinking this way. I have a whole background story on this too. For those who don't know, I lived in Chile in 2018, and I loved how small the government was in a lot of ways. And I kept finding ways that I was the trained flea. I don't know if you guys know that analogy, but we're talking about flea circuses. I don't even know how I know this. I think I know this from Merry Melody to begin with. But you put a flea in a box, you put a lid on a box, and the fleas can jump really high. They learn where the top of the box is because they bump into it. And then they learn, well, it's not worth jumping higher than that because I keep, running into a layer. So you can take the lid off the box and the flea will never jump higher than that, right? It's the same thing as training elephants to be chained to chained. There's all these like habitual ways that we kind of self-train. And I lost my own train of thought there.
Yeah, I mean, you were in Chile, so you were saying you found yourself the trained flea, not jumping higher than a limit you perceived, but which did not actually exist.
So in the US, we have this idea of an open bottle. Can't drive with an open bottle, can't walk around a town with an open bottle, right? So I was in a little festival that was going on, and I only drink dark beer. There was a whole bunch of light beer. Didn't drink beer because nothing I was interested in. On the way out, I was with a bunch of friends, and on the way out, I saw dark beer, and I was like, "Oh man, there it is. We just didn't walk around enough." And I had this thought. We were walking down to the beach 3 or 4 blocks away, and I said to my friend, "Can I buy a beer and walk it down to the beach?" And he looks at me like I'm crazy, and he's like, "Yeah, of course you can." And and I just had this moment of like, wow, like
Yeah,
I almost just threw away the idea because I'm a trained flea. I know
yeah,
that I
yeah.
can't have an open bottle. So
This I just have to mention this just happened to me. It is so funny that you just told that story because I was just on vacation last week and this exact scenario happened. I saw people walking around. I asked the bartender, like, wait, can I like take my beer out of the bar? And the bartender looked at me and he was like, you can do whatever you want. You can drive with that beer as long as you have your shirt on. The police won't pull you over, which I just thought was really funny. You have to have a shirt on, but you can drink and drive.
so we've got a lot of things like that, and one of the things we're trained in, and man, I'm a great example of this, is being nice to each other, right? Being inclusive, right? We're not really largely a confrontational culture, I'd say. So when we to finally come back to the point a long time ago, the idea of evicting people, right, kicking people out of the community, even the phraseology we use, right? Dan and I are both big on nonviolent communication. Well, kicking people out, right? Even that phraseology is
Mm,
fundamentally violent. But
mhm,
the point is removing, right?
mm,
Not participating, revoking your privilege to participate.
mm.
That seems harsh or unnecessary, or they should have done something wrong. Well, non-participation, they don't have to do something wrong,
Right.
but what do we want in the community? Do we want non-participation,
Yeah,
right?
the key is agreeing to that process beforehand. You're agreeing to join a community wherein if I don't participate in these particular ways, I will no longer be a part of that community. As
Mm-hmm.
long as that is a part of the upfront uh, treaty that you're signing with the community, then it's opt-in. So if you don't like it, then you can form a community with different rules.
Yes, yes, and this is just another very worthy tangent. The idea of a peace treaty. Why I love the term peace treaty over something like a constitution or a what did we call a mutual contract? I forget the other phraseology we played with. Dan's idea of a peace treaty is amazing because all it is an agreement. We all just
Mm,
came together and said these are the rules we're going to function by. So you can make up any rules you want, and just participate or not in that community. So
mm,
I love that idea. I love that it's going to enable experiments. It's going to enable what you might call self-expression, right? People to choose communities because they function well in that community. Think about, I don't even know how much this exists anymore. I'm sure there's some form of it, but social clubs, right? Um, one that I know still exists randomly is knitting clubs. People still get together physically and knit, hang out in cafes and knit. I see them all the time
do
in
you knit, Mike?
cafes. I did when I was a kid, actually. I learned to,
Oh,
but I don't now.
all right,
Yeah,
nice.
crocheting and knitting. Yeah,
Cool, cool.
learned that from my grandmother.
Yeah, of
I
course.
think I could
Chess
still
club.
crochet. I don't think I could still knit. I have to see if the cobwebs are too thick on that one.
Yeah, I don't know any of that.
But you'll see groups meeting in cafes and public spaces. Those social groups, you have to be a productive member. Even a reading group, right? If you have maybe super ideologically sharp views and you're just running the same agenda every time, you might get asked to leave because that's not what that group is there for.
Hmm,
And so I think considering things, thanks, Lovejoy, user agreement. That was the term we were using.
hmm,
Um, I think it doesn't hurt. In fact, it's actually very valuable to start to consider what is the minimum requirement. And it's not a punishment to enforce it. It's just a minimum requirement. And if that person wants to be part of something and not participate, great. Let's have the non-participation community.
Right.
I'm sure there will be plenty of people who would love to not participate. But we should set up that minimum and consider what is the minimum. If you really
Right.
look at why are we here and what are we up to, we have hugely committed people in this community. Just in the 300 people we have and the 150 people in the election, these are really committed people, talented, visionary, committed people. So we all are up to something. And the more we get clear what that is, the better we can say, here's what we're up to. And even just saying, here's what we're up to clearly enough and thoroughly enough, can have a bunch of people go, ugh, that's not for me. And if they want to watch, hey, it's all on chain. They can watch the whole thing on chain, YouTube, right? We're wide open. So if you want to be a spectator, there's a whole bunch of ways to be a spectator. That's easy. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, let's pop all that back off the stack and get back to this slide.
Well, Josh Seymour asks, "What is the minimum?" So, do you have an answer to that question, Mike? On with what research you've been doing, if you have certain behaviors that you think would be a reasonable starting place to say this is the minimum level of participation we should have in a community.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot with that one. Lovejoy, you're being replaced with good challenging questions.
You may decline to answer if you would like. But.
No, I love not having answers to questions like this. So first off, I want to be really clear, just in case anyone is unclear about this. I am not the one to say, right? I'll share my personal views, but I'm not the Eden community. I don't speak for the Eden community. No one does. In fact, we're individuals participating in the community. But what are my initial thoughts on minimum? Participation would be a minimum. And I would say that'd be a pretty high bar. You have to account for things like vacation or family emergencies and stuff like that. So it can't be 100%, but it should be a pretty big percentage, right? 50% seems like that would probably work. 33%.
What are these percentages of?
For instance, participation in elections. Like if you pick a particular event.
Okay. So like you should be at least at 50% of the elections, let's say. Yeah, that seems reasonable. 6 months ahead of time when the next, actually, as far in advance as you want, right? Of when the elections are. So
you have at least 30 days.
Yeah.
And, short of family emergencies, and there are some exceptions, but even if you have a vacation planned, at some point, I think we're talking about communities becoming powerful enough and cohesive enough that you'd rearrange your vacation. That sounds a little crazy given how unimportant it is to a lot of people relate to election day as like, I'm on vacation. I'll mail in a ballot, right? And maybe we'll have some kind of, well, I guess we can't have a mail-in ballot, but it could get important enough that, well, I better be there. I better find out before I schedule anything. When is the next election?
So if you participate in, let's say, 100% of the elections, but you're not in any of the Telegram chats or Discord chats and not providing any other sort of thought leadership or participation, what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
enough?
I think we can start to look at the different pieces rather than cast it that way. Let's add. So let's just conservatively say 33% of elections, right? More than half the time you can, or slightly less than half the time you can participate. I think that's a low bar. I'm not committing to that, but that's a low bar. And then what other kind of participation would we want? Well, when we have a dispute resolution system, if you're called to be on a jury, right? You've already been elected to be a delegate. So if you're a delegate and you're called to be on a jury, well, we should have an expectation of how often can you respond to that. We'll give people the option. You can yay or nay participation. But if you turn down 5 out of 10 requests, I don't know about that. That should impact your reputation as a delegate.
Yeah, I like that you're focusing on like events and formal some sort of formal participation as opposed to the types of things I was mentioning, like Telegram chats and stuff, because these are, I think it would be very difficult to measure or make any sort of objective case against someone based on their lack of participation in a Telegram chat, because there's all
Yeah.
kinds of subjective, weird barriers to some people participating that others don't have. There might even be, some people are working 3 jobs just to get through their life and don't have time to. They might be able to get to an election, but they're not going to participate in our daily chats.
Well, and as much as possible, we would like code. I don't want to say code to be the law because that implies other things. We'd like the contract to be able to evaluate stuff like this. But in where we have issues like this, we very quickly get just outside of what the contract can do, right? So let's say we have people who register to participate in an election, but then don't show up. Okay, well, how do we know they didn't show up? Well, what we proposed before this election internally was we don't have a record of them voting. But you can have other reasons to not vote. So that's not really a tight way to do that.
Right.
So then we go one more step out and we say, okay, well, what if you have a dive bomber participant who shows up 5 minutes before the end of the first round meeting and votes? I don't know. That doesn't seem right to me, right? Heard none of the discourse and voted anyway. That doesn't feel right. So then we need to look at rules like 80% of the time of a meeting, you have to be there. Something like that, right? So yeah, I'm going to look at specific events and things that, while the contract can't measure it, if you were on a jury, I want to make it really, really easy, right? We watch the video and you go, yeah, this person heard none of the conversation and voted anyway. Or this person, what's another example? Well, this person said they would be there, and clearly from the participation record, they weren't there. We'd like as black and white as possible. We want to be on that black and white law side of justice as often as possible.
Right. Yeah, the jury's duty is to just be the oracle, basically, to tell the contract what actually happened. And then the rules are so well defined that if you know what happened, you know how to react.
Exactly. Yeah, Oracle is the perfect, for those in the crypto community, Oracle is the perfect description there. All right, let's look at the chat. I will lose my train of thought so easily, so now I'm going to stop my train of thought and read the chat.
I didn't see any questions, but...
All right, Joshua answered that question. Like I said, I think, what do I think what would I be willing to commit to with large consequence, right? That would be how I would answer the question for myself. 50% of elections, I don't travel a lot. I don't schedule vacations a lot. So if we had one every 6 months and, they were opposite seasons, I wouldn't have any problem with that. I would assume I could attend at least 1 out of every 2 elections. And I would be aiming way higher than that. And if you consider that you do 3 elections in a row, well, that buys you, if we're going to average over time, quite a few elections that you can have a couple off, if you will. Yeah. So, yeah.
Is this your last slide, the dispute resolution slide?
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure we're not 5 slides behind.
Yeah, no problem. And Joshua says, keen to see what Dan adds to the bylaws about this. Yeah, definitely. Dan's cooking up some really good stuff. I'm very excited to see the final form of it.
I have one question about the bylaws, and it kind of ties into what we were just talking about, but maybe, so, for example, you just mentioned 80% of the meeting, you have to be there. Maybe that becomes one of the rules of the community. So now we have this number, 80%, 0.8 in your smart contract. Where does that live? And is that decoupled from the process of following or reacting to the rules in the smart contract. Was that a clear question? Or what I'm trying to ask is there a way that the community will be able to see at the end of the day, what are the parameters for this community? Oh, this
Yeah.
number is at 0.8, this number is it. And then you know from the contracts how the community will react to violations of those rules, but is there a clear way to see all the rules?
Yeah, so you would have that in the bylaws. And
Okay.
so the bylaws would be, think about if everything's in the bylaws, and the bylaws, because everything's going to be in them, and we don't want them to become unreadable, as a lot of countries' laws have become, then they've got to be the minimum. They've got to be razor thin requirements. So if we only have inductions, elections, opting in or not, and spending of money, it's most, and we'll have, I don't know, dispute resolutions, right? We're only going to have a few fundamental things that people do in the community. So if we define, when you create your profile, it's got to have these things. Well, we already have that in the UI. In fact, that was taking feedback from the community early on. We have checkboxes that say, hey, supposed to do this, supposed to do that. Picture should look like this. You should have this in your bio. And people literally check a checkbox in the UI every time on each of those things before they click submit. So they're agreeing to that stuff right in the UI. Having requirements on, for instance, an election round, 80% of the time, make a vote in, let's say, given how consensus works, you kind of have to reconsider even how voting works. Maybe you say you have to vote once out of every 3 rounds, because what are you doing if you're not voting ever? You're not really contributing to consensus. So you could make some kind of measure on votes. Black and white, but not necessarily to the contract. So it all just goes in the bylaw. The bylaws then become a Ricardian contract that show up when you join. They show up when you maybe cast your vote in a jury. Maybe even when you cast your, how would you say that? When you submit your dispute, right? When you request dispute resolution, you would read that same Ricardian. Here are the rules, and I'm submitting this dispute because one of these rules has been broken. So it'd be in the bylaws, which would be presented as a Ricardian contract.
Great. Okay. Cool.
All right, 2 other topics I want to throw out, and we obviously don't have a lot of time to discuss them, but I do want to throw them out. We've been discussing them, but I want to call them out as a topic. For justice, to come back to this slide, scope. What is the scope of the types of disputes we'll see? Are we going to see are we going to see a divorce proceeding purely on chain in the Eden community? I don't know. That's an interesting question to ask, right? We don't quite have, enforcement looks very different in Eden. Some things, the worst we have is to kick you out, right? The highest punishment we have. Or are you going to see a murder case if the worst you can do is kick someone out? That doesn't make any sense either, right? So scope is a critical thing. Are we going to see cases that have to do with money? Probably doesn't matter whether there's money or not. How subjective, right? Harassment cases, libel cases, right? There's going to be a scope to define there of what disputes even make sense to see. And maybe the choice is, it's free market. We'll see anything that someone's willing to submit themselves to Eden resolution and jurors are willing to see. Maybe you leave it wide open and it's a free market, whatever we all agree to. That's kind of consistent with the peace treaty.
Does that then imply that there would be some mechanism by which jurors could reach consensus that we're not going to rule on this dispute because we're rejecting it as a dispute?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Maybe we send a request. There's a new dispute and we request from 10 jurors and we require a minimum of, let's say, 5, and we just don't get 5. Right. Or we get 5, but maybe the first part of the process is this a valid submission? And they can vote no.
Interesting.
So That's scope. And then how does it work? We kind of just got into that, but what's the process, right? There has to be a process. And that process can look any way, but again, informed by history, preferably, because we've tried a lot of things. And anyone who has been through, what's a good example? I mean, what comes to mind is laws that people don't agree with. In San Francisco, juror nullification is used all the time, so that when people are brought up on marijuana charges, they never go. I don't know if the case never happens or if it's just never ruled against them. But the view that that law is not valid just never has anyone. Well, never. I don't know the stats, but it was a case I heard a lot about where it's not a problem. You don't have to worry about the courts ruling against you in that case. I don't have any personal experience, but I have lots and lots of people I've talked to about divorces and custody, right? Custody of kids. These are ways that we know the court system seems to provide an unfair result. Well, why is that, right? What's the structure? What's the incentive structure? What has divorce proceedings be so unfair, right? It comes back to some black and white law. What are the laws involved? Some judge and jury. Who are these people and what's motivating them? What's their subjective view of fairness? And then critically, and how do you get a consistent view of what's going on in a relationship when you have two, a husband and wife who are massively adversely related to each other? Who do you believe? Where do you get your evidence? It's a private life. Where do you get your evidence? And there's discovery, like you find evidence, but it's not easy. It's not an easy type of case.
Well, it seems like you have your work cut out for you, Mike. Hope you solve that. Let me know when it's all buttoned up nicely.
We'll get it all done this week and we'll move on. Everybody will be happy. All right. Well, James, thanks for joining me today. James, I'll hand the steering reins over to you. In fact, I'll set you up this week for being the host with the reins with Brandon next week. But I really appreciate you being on and appreciate your perspective and questions and commitment to this community.
Yeah, I always watched these videos, found them very helpful. So yeah, when Lovejoy announced he was stepping down, I wanted to make sure it continued. I personally find value. So thank you for being a part of it, and same to Brandon Pancher.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for everybody listening. There's so much positive emoji going on in the chat. Han, Max, Lovejoy, Joshua, thanks for... Yet. Yeah, no emojis, Josh. Come on, what are you doing? let's get a colorful, happy emoji in there. But anyway, I appreciate you guys participating and caring about this community, and look forward to seeing you out there in cyberspace.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye. I think I'm still live now, and I don't know how to leave. Oh, I found it. Bye, everyone.